Sometimes you just need to write a real bastard. Pure evil villains are a common archetype in all sorts of flavors of storytelling. And today we're going to talk about the nuances of writing what one might expect would be a very one-dimensional type of character or force in a world. There are some ways in which that assumption can be correct, but others in which it very much isn't, and those are what we'll be focusing on, but we have to set the parameters of this discussion with part 1, how pure can evil be? Defining evil in general, much less its undiluted variant, is not something that can be done in a particularly definite nor universally recognized way. So for that reason, I'm immediately making a discretion here to say that my opinions on what evil is and its existence or non-existence or anything about its nature are purely my opinion, and it probably differs from yours. So my aim is to work with what are probably our relatively common definitions that we can sort of generally agree on for the practical purposes of writing. With that said, for many people, evil is one of those you know it when you see it sorts of things. Murder is bad, and that's agreed upon both culturally and pretty much always legally across human civilization. However, to take this example, the act of one person killing another can take on various moral qualities that people would tend to agree will carry different weights. Example 1 might be someone walking up to a random person they've never met and know nothing about on the street and shoving them into traffic. Example 2 might be pulling the plug on life support for someone who's been in a coma for a decade with no chance of ever waking up. At least not much of a chance. And example 3 might be shooting a hostage taker when it appears they're about to execute their hostage. These are all killings, but as you probably understand intuitively, these are all very different circumstances. And while there are some absolutist positions on these sorts of scenarios, or some variance between them, people would typically agree that example 1 is completely unjustified as a killing, example 2 makes practical sense and is fairly likely to be considered justified, but might be complicated by the fact that it's weighing the material difficulty of continuing to preserve the person against the chance, however slight it might be, that they could maybe potentially recover someday. Though the circumstances obviously make it more nuanced than this, it's basically weighing money against life. Example 3 also makes practical sense and might be argued to be justified by a similar percentage of people to example 2, but will be complicated, likely in retrospect, as in such a scenario. A decision might have to be made too quickly for this to really be thought about in the moment, by the fact that ideally both the hostage taker and the hostage could be taken alive, and that decision made doing so impossible, trading the near guarantee of the hostage taker's death for the near guarantee of the hostage's survival, prioritizing the hostage's survival chances over another choice, which might allow the hostage taker to survive but would lower the chances of the hostage's survival. And at the same time, arguments could be made that all or none of these are evil. Arguing all of these killings are bad would probably be a whole lot easier than arguing they're all not bad, but let's explore those two briefly. Arguing all of these killings are evil could come from a standpoint that all killing is bad with an absolute disregard for circumstance. Arguing none of them were bad, however, would probably have to either incorporate new details, forcing the story to imply those to be killed would somehow deserve it, or if not modifying the original story, maybe some sort of nihilistic "it doesn't matter if you kill them," or "evil is not a real thing, so there cannot be a moral judgment of the killings" sort of argument is something I could see existing. I'm not explaining those viewpoints from an unbiased point of view, so don't take that as the ultimate expression of what those could look like. But to me, just to set us a baseline for what the rest of this video will look like in terms of my opinion, however not valuable that may be, is that example 1 to me is something that is unjustified and that I would call evil and would use as a benchmark for evil as we'll be talking about it. 2 is potentially justified, dependent on circumstances, which are not present in the scenario, and 3 is justified if it's done at such a time or circumstances dictate that it is the best safe way to preserve the hostage's life. I don't think any of those are particularly spicy takes, but they are what they are. And now that we have done some sort of framework for establishing what evil maybe is or isn't, we can ask the question, what is pure evil? It's a tricky question, and that's why I did this whole example thing for it. Because in order to describe something at its purest, you have to not be conflating any part of it with any other element. Scenario 1's traffic shoving is the closest to what I think we'd all agree is pure evil, but there could be conflating factors, if we're being generous. Perhaps the killer is on a sort of mental break. They're not of sound mind. Perhaps they've mistaken the victim for someone else who would maybe be more deserving of being shoved into traffic. Maybe they thought it was a funny prank and were just very misguided. These explanations all dilute the purity of the act's evil with either mental health circumstances, recklessness, or ignorance. That doesn't make them good reasons to do this, but it means that the evil, the core of the evil of it, while still present, is definitely not pure. Pure evil would be more like shoving the person into traffic because the killer likes inflicting suffering on others, and for little other reason. We're a lot closer to pure there. There could still be circumstances that led them to this place. Maybe they had a poor home life as a child. Maybe they were raised not to value the lives of other people or any other such thing. But at the end of the day, they still killed someone for no good reason. So instead, we're going to redefine this concept, at least for our purposes. I think acts can be essentially pure evil, but probably not people. People can get real close, maybe 99.99% of the way, but I don't think ever all the way to 100. That 0.01% may never be relevant, may never show itself, may never prevent somebody from doing bad things, but it is probably in there somewhere as just a base part of existing, the same way that everybody's probably got at least a little bit of bad in them. So how do you write characters and actions that approach that 100% mark? I'll present that through Part 2, the Fundamental Disregard. All actions that we might define as evil, in my mind, can be classed or at least put through a framework of disregard. Disregard for human life, disregard for the emotions of others, disregard for the belongings of others, disregard for the well-being of animals. These are all ways we could explain what evil looks like. You wouldn't say the disregard of human cruelty to describe a good act, would you? Of course, it isn't a perfectly rational definition. Disregard in this context implies a moral connotation in of itself. Saying disregard for human life implies there should be regard for human life, which isn't objectively true, even though we'd probably all agree that it's right. It also doesn't really apply to non-thinking or non-sapient actors. Disease isn't evil because it has a disregard for your immune system, nor is a bear evil because of its disregard for your life when it's hungry. This disregard is made evil because it is disregard from an entity that is fully capable of having it. This is actually one of the same reasons that you could argue eldritch gods and sort of cosmic horror stories aren't even evil, because typically the perspective is informed by the idea that they barely register humans as being things of any significance at all, much less moral agents. With all of this ridiculous definition making finally done, we can work on that key phrase, the fundamental disregard. This framing allows for a lot of reasons for the character or entity you're writing to have that sort of disregard. There is both the disregard for human life in the small-scale individual sense of a character simply being cruel to those around them, but there's also a disregard for human life in the dictator who sends his conscript army to kill and die in a war with no greater purpose. The former disregard, as mentioned, likely exists merely because that person has a cruel disposition for one reason or another, and that reason itself could be explored. With the second, that disregard could be informed by cruelty too, sure, but it could also be greed for the potential spoils of the conflict, perhaps a lust for power that would come with the control of more land, or maybe the hope for an ego boost and a place in the history books, whether as a villain or not. Should you be writing a character meant to be thoroughly evil, not the sort you'd redeem under any circumstances, the most important thing you can do to prevent them from becoming the archetypical mustache twirler is to make the reason for their disregard interesting, or at least make sense. Pure evil characters are at their worst when they're so unrelentingly bad for seemingly no reason, and also for a related factor. I've been saying you can't ever reach 100% pure evil, and the main reason for that is particularly in the case of evil characters who are in charge of things. 100% pure evil does not lead to any real scenario in which anybody would allow them to be in charge of a thing, unless their subordinate subordinates are just as pure evil, or in some other way not possessing of free will to change it. It might actually make some sense for a demon king, for example, to be essentially pure evil, as those who serve under him might be cut from the same cloth, and the cosmological reason for his being a demon king may even be dependent on him being purely evil. But if the character is a human or human-like being, with subordinates that are moral agents with their own free will, there's no way that a 100% unrestrained pure evil character would be able to maintain control. Do not mistake what I'm saying for meaning that evil people can't be in charge of things. It's just that if someone is so disregarding, so unrestrained in their cruelty as to be pure evil, if they're the type which shoots people for looking at them wrong 100% of the time, who betrays people at whim for no reason but their own amusement, who is violent and unpredictable in their use of it, then there's no way the institution they're in charge of could actually withstand that. Evil, as we're defining it, is essentially an inherently destructive force, and institutions are as vulnerable to destruction as anything else. There needs to be a portion of this character, however small, capable of doing things for the benefit of others, or at least not for their direct detriment. For showing restraint, for resisting their own wrath selectively. Fear may be an effective tool for a ruler, but it will not last if it's the only thing keeping people in line within a system that is entirely self-destroying at the hands of its leader. Even the world's worst dictators typically pay their guards pretty well. Of course, none of this is to say you shouldn't write characters that are like this, that are so evil as to be self-destroying. We have plenty of examples of real-life people that were like that, who, as a result of their wanton cruelty, evil, and lack of restraint, made a system that destroyed them. Stalin, for example, dug his own grave. He had a stroke in his room, and even though the guards outside had an inkling something was wrong, they were so afraid of him that they didn't come inside to check on him, guaranteeing that he died there because he wasn't going to get that medical attention he needed. For a comparable example from another podium position in the top 3 worst guys ever, take Hitler in the Nazis. For all the advantages Nazi Germany had in World War II, it was their own quality of being Nazis that often defeated them. Even in the overzealous confidence in opening fronts with and expecting to somehow win against the United States, USSR, and British Commonwealth combined plus more, the cruelty of their rule fostered the resistances across their empire that made the war so much more winnable for the Allies. The irrationality of their plans led them to wasting time and money on fruitless Wunderwaffen. Even Stalingrad, the largest land battle in history, was lost worse by the Nazis, being unwilling to accept they were losing the battle, even promoting Paulus to field marshal because German field marshals weren't supposed to ever surrender, so they hoped he would just off himself instead. That kind of evil is self-destructive, and that's something worth considering for your characters. There is a certain level of someone still essentially being entirely terrible, yet managed enough that they can maintain their cruel regime over time, but also a degree of it to which it will start destroying whatever institution they're a part of from the inside. The leader of either system may be well worth calling pure evil, but the way in which their evil impacts their decision-making will determine in part how their rule's actually going to turn out. Part of that expression is itself going to be part of their personality, which we'll discuss in part 3, cold evil versus hot evil. This is one of those turns of phrase that's really fun to me, because even though cold evil and hot evil don't really have a literal meaning, you probably understand exactly what I mean already, even if you haven't heard this term before. Hot evil is the raging murderer, the corn berserker for the Warhammer fans among you. Hot evil is that disregard fueled by an excess of emotion. This flavor can actually get a bit of a bad rap at times, because when written a certain way, the enraged evil will evoke feelings like this meme, where they end up becoming less intimidating by their intensity not being matched by the people they're fighting against, and thus making them look essentially pathetic through their inability to control their temper. There are ways around this, but one of the most important things to remember when regarding figures like this is that hot evil isn't always hot, and for some characters they may be intertwined, the evil only being present when the heat is as well. To work off our Corn Berserker example, we can take one of them, a funny little guy called Karn the Betrayer, as a great way to show off this archetype. As we see him in the book, mock betrayer, when outside of combat he's actually kind of a chill guy, still ultimately not a great or particularly ethical person, but not the frothing maniac that typically characterizes him. It's only when he's in battle and the butcher's nails, an implant that makes him crave battle, activate that he becomes quite so bloodthirsty. And it's in those moments he loses the less of those regards that he has. And this is the sort of thing you should play off of when writing hot, evil characters. They can almost have two different types of personalities. What they're like in their moments of calm versus how they are when their emotions are running high. And it doesn't even have to be rage. Fear is an equally powerful and even useful motivator for someone to do bad things. In post-apocalyptic stories of all types, we see cases where one survivor kills another, not because they hated them or because they were an active, violent threat, but instead because of the fear that that person may have become a threat. This is a really random example, but this was the first thing to come to my mind while I wrote this script. If we're to take Dead by Daylight's biography for this character as canon, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie is that type of hot evil. Leatherface kills not from a desire to exert his will over others, to satisfy carnal urges, or even to quiet the voices in his head. He kills because he is scared. Scared that others will hurt him, scared that his family will be displeased with him, scared that their shared willingness to eat human flesh will be discovered. While not exactly a literary example, it still goes to show how hot evil is the product of unrestrained emotion. Even generally positive ones like love can be the motivator. This is what George Lucas was going for in Anakin Skywalker's transformation into Darth Vader in the prequel movies, where most of the evils he does are driven by his love for Padme, rather than any particular calculating nature or hatred and rage in of themselves. They only came as a product of that love. It's also why Palpatine thought correctly that Anakin could be controlled and manipulated into doing the things he did. Anyway, with the way I've been framing this so far, you can probably guess that cold evil is meant to be the opposite of this, where emotions are so well regulated by this character to the point that it becomes their lack of emotionality that often informs their fundamental disregards. I've actually found relatively recently that cold evil is pretty popular from people who pay attention to these sorts of things. Much like the stupid monkey and lion meme I showed earlier, it seems audiences at the moment tend to agree that if you want your villain to be scary while still being essentially a human, because it is a bit simpler to make a monstrous villain scary, then all you need to do is make them that calm, collected sort of evil, or even setbacks are brushed off as mere inconveniences, where their feud with the protagonist isn't because they have some burning hatred for them, but merely because that protagonist is in the way. A lot of this, I think, comes down to our perception of confidence. If someone believes what they're saying about themselves, those who see that are more likely to believe them. If you have a villain say the equivalent of "Curse you, Perry the Platypus," when they're thwarted, it's clear the protagonist's actions are having quite an effect on them, and that they aren't actually confident they're going to come out on top. Also, Doofenshmirtz isn't evil, he's just misunderstood. Meanwhile, if we get a muted or no reaction at all to the hero's achievements, it almost gives the impression that the villain still has a lot of cards up their sleeve, that it wasn't really that big of a deal. But this is only one aspect of the cold evil villain. The fundamental meaning of a villain being this way is that they are tapped out of their emotions. This can have uses in making a machine or robotic type of villain, much like the Terminator, but it's also for the mastermind archetype, with one of the best examples of those being Gustavo Fring from Breaking Bad, who only loses emotional control maybe twice in the whole show. He also proves that a cold evil villain doesn't have to be emotionless. This distinction I'm making is all about control of them. Hot evil villains don't really have that control, and cold evil villains either have to have it, or with those more robotic types, they don't need the emotional control. This does, however, create yet another distinction. That if cold evil villains continue their evil despite being in control of the emotions that might cause a hot evil villain to act irrationally, one could argue that the evil of a cold villain is more fundamental to their person. That this is how they shape themselves to be and act on purpose. They're in control of being this way, and furthermore, their being that way is less forgivable in the sense that many of them could choose to let their emotions, that little voice in their head, their conscience, whatever you want to call it, prevent them from doing the things they do, but they don't. They disregard that voice intentionally. And of course, it goes without saying that this dichotomy, though I do think it's helpful and a lot of fun, is not sufficient to describe everything. Nor is really any dichotomy or framework intended to describe the range of things you can do with your writing, especially in regard to characters. Some are hot evil sometimes and cold evil others. Some are able to control their emotions in certain types of situations and not others. Breaking Bad returns to the conversation for a moment, and spoiler, though I really think everybody essentially knows this is true, my finger will stay up until the spoilers are over. That's how Walter White is. When in the guise of Heisenberg, he's the perfect cold evil villain, pulling ruthless stuff to get his way, from poisoning a child to letting his partner's girlfriend die of an overdose. And yet, since we follow him even when he's not wearing the hat, we can also see how honestly pathetic he is at times. How there are still those embers of the better person he used to be, and how he continues to think that he can exercise the same control over his home life that he does over his drug empire. People are complicated, even villains. If there is anything I hope I've imparted upon you with this video, it's that even extremely evil characters can have a lot of depth to them, if it's something your story would benefit from. Which I'd argue most would, but sometimes you really do just need that mustache twirler, and that's okay. But if your story does call for more than uncomplicated evil, you should know how to achieve it. But for today, that'll be it from me. If this sounds like a place you want to be, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. As we close out, I'd like to thank our patrons, Shadowrunner, Sonny, Isaac Parrott, Raymond Don Sadako, Cavalier, and Sazabi of the Knights of the Inner Circle, Vion and Jodion Void our Knights, and Greer, TOW, Craig, Victoria, Lauren, and Noah, our loyal squires. And remember, hot evil, cold evil, uncomplicated evil. Anything is better than stupid evil.